Welcome, everybody. Welcome. We started something new a couple of years back, myself and some panelists. This is the opening discussant, and so that's what I am. My name is Lanita Jacobs, and welcome to Talking and Testifying to Black Humanity, producing Black linguistic anthropology then and now. All right, what compels us, what compelled this panel when we organized it was, of course, the conference theme and the guiding question, what counts as evidence in anthropology? We had another motivating factor, and that's critical reflexivity, this business of thinking about how we think, why we're doing the work that we're doing, our positionality in the field as a means of inquiry and analysis among Native Black linguistic anthropologists. Another guiding motivation is the imperative, and I can't stress this enough, of naming Black linguistic anthropology as a means of talking and testifying to Black humanity. The panelists to come will expound upon what that means, talking and testifying to Black humanity, which many of you may already know is a riff on Geneva Smitherman's good work. Now, this imperative of naming Black linguistic anthropology as a means of talking and testifying to Black humanity is, of course, inspired by the recent election results in 2016. And I think Prince helps to express it best. We are in his hometown, and he has gone from us, but he has left us this gift called Dreamer. I want to play just the first 2 minutes and 15 seconds of it just to set the scene, to honor him, and also allow him to riff on why he expected more from a loving nation and to lament that race still matters in the 21st century. Let's listen. He should be turned up. That's it. Yes. Call us dreamers too. The folks on this panel include Crystal A. Smalls, who was also the co-organizer. She's going to be talking about Black semiosis, theorizing Black ways of speaking as survival codes, followed by Eva Michelle Wheeler, who will be talking about shouting into the void, counter discourses on race and identity in the Dominican Republic. Awad and Eileen could not make it, so we're not going to be hearing from them, but we will be hearing from Arthur K. Spears, who is also a discussant and co-organizer. The title of our panel is Talking and Testifying to Black Humanity, and how do the panelists plan to do that? Well, they plan to do that by asking, how do contemporary scholars critically and consciously mine disciplinary tropes and analytical conventions to stake authoritative claims about languaging and speakers, race and language politics, and ways of seeing in and beyond the field? They also ask, what does it mean to bear scholarly witness and pursue scholarly legitimacy within language-oriented disciplines? And I'm sure this is a question we all are considering for ourselves. Then they hone in on this. In what ways do native Black language scholars strategically employ canonical tools and marshal and deploy evidence to translate and explain anew issues of cultural heterogeneity, fragility, suffering, and survival within and beyond Black communities? Must they reimagine language-related disciplines in service of this work? Crystal Smalls begins this labor in her presentation on Black semiosis. She homes in. Did you guys know that's the way you say it? It's homes in, not homes in. I've been saying homes in all my life, but homes in on indirectness among Gullah Geechee speakers in South Carolina that enables them to talk without a white person knowing that they're doing it. And she views this as one of many decidedly Black ways of speaking and survival codes. The beautiful thing about her presentation to come is she reminds us that we must never lose sight of materiality of race and the ways that Black folks experience their bodies in historically specific ways. In fact, attending to race, anti-Black racism, and what Shirley Ann Tate calls affective racial economies can serve to reconfigure existing theory altogether. Small shows us this through her praxis-oriented and critically reflexive scholarship that serves to elide meta-theoretical contextual foreclosures in her discipline, and in doing so decolonizes linguistic and semiotic anthropology. Get ready. We move on to Eva Michelle Wheeler, whose presentation, Shouting into the Void, occurred to her as an apt metaphor for examining counter-discourses of race and identity in the Dominican Republic. She found herself, why shouting into the void, she found herself among a minority of scholars fighting for a more nuanced view of race in the Dominican context that was not prefigured by the West, or Western notions of Blackness, or red Dominicans who identified as Indio as evidence of their racial inauthenticity or as a denial of their true identity. Actually, her research participants stake bold claims on their identity as Negro as opposed to Indio based on physical markers that bespeak Blackness, such as hair texture, nose width, skin color. And they also explicitly honed in their lives counter-hegemonic consciousness in ways that she'll be discussing. Her focus on language and race in the Dominican Republic seeks to give voice to folks at the academic and social margins, thus talking and testifying to Black humanity, diversity, and complexity. Her work complicates notions of Black Dominican exceptionalism and bespeaks commonalities between Afro-descended people in the West. And the final thing I want to say is I can dig it. My job as an opening discussant is to try to get you excited about the papers to come, but I'm taking some selfish time to just let them know that I feel them. Some convergences. The woman there with her beautiful hair says she loves her natural hair. In my own research, much like Wheeler, I found Black hair and physical features to be markers of Blackness. In fact, hair can act as that telltale sign insofar as hair texture and hairstyle as corporeal signifiers that narrate and situate at the same time. And much like the panelists, in my work on stand-up comedy from 9/11 to Obama, I was in the comedy clubs in Los Angeles, initially trying to figure out what Black folks had to say, if anything, about 9/11, and ended up writing a paper about that a year later, and then couldn't leave the clubs until Obama, and found that notions of the real Blackness permeated, ran through like a steady through line, Black stand-up comedy at pivotal points, 9/11, Hurricane Katrina, that moment when Michael Richards called those Black guys in the club, niggers, 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 the election of Barack Obama, and then more recently, Rachel Dolezal humor and Trump humor. So notions of the real permeated this, and to even talk about why, let me get back to this slide. Much like the panelists, I felt like I was shouting not so much into a void, but prefigured dialogues around real Blackness, especially in anthropology. We are very much interested in deconstructing notions of racial authenticity, and I want to step back and enter that discussion again with a focus on why notions of racial authenticity might matter to Black folks, when the shit hits the fan and also when things are calm and still. And I very much feel Eva when she felt like she was shouting in the void to make her point. Like the panelists, I found it necessary to center considerations of race and anti-Black racism unapologetically in my work in order to write towards liberty, mutuality, and legibility. I've also had to draw from analytical paradigms within and beyond linguistic anthropology, humor studies, cultural studies, queer studies, in order to situate the globally recognized comedic icon that is Kevin Hart as a trickster. Think about that for a second. I'm sure maybe that gives you some pause. But that was a big deal for me, to be contending with this comedy research and find myself kind of walking away from linguistic anthropology in order to be able to say some other things that I just need to say. I found that situating Black language, cultural practices, and aesthetics as decidedly Black pushes against merely deconstructionist imperatives and enables new verses that implicate power, resistance, and agency, or in other words, speak to Black humanity. A final convergence has to do with this. I'll never forget a colleague of mine who did not get a tenure at a prestigious university but went on to bigger and better things and is renowned for thinking about global Blackness. And we were at dinner one night, a group of scholars of color talking about our work and the work that we have to do to kind of push past canonical tropes and say something. And we were all commiserating. You know, when you get drinking, everybody gets a little bit more honest. And she broke through all the discourse with one chant, and it was this: "Let me live." And it just pretty much summed up everything that we were saying, because the question was, how can one achieve legitimacy and freedom as a Native anthropologist? Can we think and write free towards Black humanity? The panelists and others write towards freedom and translation via a generative and decisive critical reflexivity that is not so much about narcissism or apology, but about trying to unpack when and where they enter the field and to re-marshal new ways of being in the field, new ways of seeing language and analyzing language towards a kind of freeing and praxis-oriented scholarship. Here are some other convergences that speak to recent attempts in this regard. And also Black linguistics. On the right are some of my colleagues who are doing work in their own way that participates in the larger work of this panel. And so let's go. I'm going to turn this over to Arthur K. Spears. He is our discussant as well as our chair. Thank you.
Okay, as you know, two of our speakers had problems, actually tragedies that they had to deal with. They aren't going to be here today. So we're going to operate as just one session. So we aren't going to go in strict 15-minute chunks. So our next speaker is Eva Michelle Wheeler. And I'm going to turn the floor over to her. Okay. Now, one thing that I will say, I had some technical problems with my wonderful Surface. And so what I've done instead of PowerPoint is I've got some handouts that I'm going to put right down here. And if you'd like to look at those, they're available. Okay.
Good morning. You guys out there, you awake? Excellent. Just take a few moments for my presentation to come up. And there we are. Shouting into the void, counter discourses on race and identity in the Dominican Republic. Although described by Dominican scholar Silvio Torres Sayant as the cradle of Blackness in the Americas, academic and social discourses often frame the Dominican Republic as a pariah of the Black diaspora, a setting characterized by its exceptional negrophobia, xenophobia, confusion, and denial. The broad strokes of these discourses on Dominican exceptionalism shout to the world that Dominicans are in complete denial of who they are, And these shouts threaten to silence the Afro-affirming voices that also exist in this setting. However, as my work on language and race in the Dominican Republic gives voice to the people at the academic and social margins, it talks and testifies to Black humanity, Black diversity, and the complexity of Black identities. And I'll just mention briefly the black boxes go over the word Black. So the quote says, "I think nobody's negro here. We are told you are Black. Oh no, I am not Black, I am something else. Dominicans are in complete denial of who they are." And that's a quote from Henry Louis Gates' series, Black in Latin America. Although much non-linguistic research on race overlooks language as a primary analytic concern, a long-standing tradition within linguistics has demonstrated the central role of language in how individuals and cultures understand race. Buckle to synthesize the existing body of knowledge on language and race and concludes that this relationship is clear in at least 3 ways. First, in the use of racial terms. Second, in racial discourse. And third, in linguistic performance of race. This present project explores racial discourse in the Dominican setting and analyzes the content of this discourse and the broader social context in which it is produced. Based on ethnographic observation and interviews in the Dominican Republic, the present study interrogates the critical intersection of language and race in the Dominican setting. Specifically, the analysis explores non-traditional discourses on Blackness, the African imaginary in the Dominican setting, and the positionality of a Black researcher in this space. With language as the lens, this project engages affirmations of Blackness that often go unnoticed, and critiques the exceptionalism attributed to the Dominican racial setting. I selected 3 regionally distinct sites for the fieldwork for this study: Santiago de los Caballeros, Santo Domingo, and Dajabon. At each site, as I observed and participated in daily life, people spoke freely about race, color, and identity. I selected 23 interview participants using snowball and convenient sampling techniques at each of the 3 research sites. The participants range in age from 20 to 65 and represent both sexes, 12 men and 11 women. These participants also represent several diverse socioeconomic perspectives: barrio, working class, middle class, and upper middle class. Furthermore, participants are roughly evenly divided across research sites. For the interview portion of the study, I designed questions to elicit information about the meaning and norms for deployment for 11 racial terms. I additionally asked participants how they describe themselves based on their physical appearance and how others would describe them. The data for the present study emerged largely from these descriptions of self and others. I began the discussion by examining how participants in the Dominican Republic discuss Blackness in traditional and non-traditional ways. I set the discussion against the backdrop of the quote included at the beginning of this presentation, because the expressed opinion that Dominicans are in complete denial of who they are is consistent with prevailing academic and social consensus on the topic. Participant responses across research sites problematize this sweeping generalization. Eliezer, a professor in Santiago, discusses Blackness and race in professional and personal contexts and describes the pushback he receives when he identifies himself as negro. Eliezer is a professor of sociology, Dominican-Haitian relations, and Caribbean culture and history. He states, "I, with much pride, am negro." He goes on to describe how when he makes this statement in his classes, his students who would describe him as indiecito claro ask incredulously, "Professor, you're negro?" In these interactions with his students, Eliezer disrupts traditional discourses on Dominican racial identity by choosing to identify as negro, despite the fact that society would expect him to identify otherwise. Eliezer then turns to the racial dynamics in his home. He has 2 daughters, and his wife is my color, morena. He speaks about how one of his daughters describes herself as indiecita clara and describes her sister as indiecita oscura. "Careful," he recounts, telling her, "Here we are negros, and with much honor." As Eliezer affirms his own Blackness, his discourses shape the way that those in his sphere of influence see and understand race. His students see a positive image of a professor affirming Blackness, and his daughters learn that Blackness is something that they should possess with pride. Another participant, Alex, a student in Santo Domingo, describes how some people see Blackness as the most undesirable thing. Alex explains that many would consider negro the most negative thing that can exist in this country. When I ask Alex how he would describe himself, he says, "I am negro." In light of his statement that negro can be viewed negatively, I ask whether negro is negative for him, to which Alex responds, "For me, no. I feel proud to be a Dominican negro." He continues, "They have negro as the worst thing that can exist. Not for me. Negro is the most beautiful thing there is." To cement this proclamation, Alex blows himself a kiss. As Alex talks about blackness, he has no illusions about how blackness is generally positioned. Nevertheless, he does not shy away from his own black identity, proclaiming instead that blackness can be not only beautiful, but even the most beautiful thing there is. Romeo, a government employee in Santo Domingo, demonstrates how the use of racial terminology can vary according to whether a person is describing race or skin color. When we begin the interview, I ask him to describe himself, and Romeo uses the term trigueño to describe his physical appearance. He explains that trigueño describes a middle space for people who are not white and not really dark. Later in the interview, I ask Romeo how he would describe his race, as opposed to his skin color, and he responds that his race is negro. The phrasing of the question in this way, race versus physical description, elicits a completely different term. I ask Romeo if he is framing his race in terms of his provenance, and he explains a popular saying that alleges that all Dominicans have an African past. Yes, it has to do with provenance. Although my family supposedly comes from France, that type of thing. My grandmother was blanca. They tell me that she had fine features and all that. But everyone that is born here, there is a saying, they have negro behind their ear. Romeo's comments indicate the methodological importance of specificity in conversations on race, color, and identity, because the shift from one metric to another can change the conversation. This fact is particularly important for researchers who are cultural or linguistic outsiders in a given setting. This is also a point at which language becomes critical. When asked about their ancestry, most Dominicans who have African descent will acknowledge it, as in the case of Romeo, who explains how Dominicans are black behind the ear. However, this acknowledgement of African descent does not smoothly transition to the foregrounding of a black identity. These discourses reveal that race in the Dominican Republic is conceptualized in a way that can disrupt hegemonic discourses on blackness. Manuel is a local folklorist in Dajabon, and during the interview, we speak about how ideas of race have changed and continue to change in the country. According to Manuel, Dominican history has primarily been written from the perspective of those who hold a more Hispanicized vision of the country. But people are beginning to accept the place of African heritage and culture. Although his cédula describes him as indio, Manuel states that other people would describe him as mulatto and that he identifies his race as negro. Although Eliezer, Alex, Romeo, and Manuel acknowledge their African ancestry, this is not the case for all Dominicans. Fernando, the director of a nonprofit organization in Dajabon, states that the Dominican Republic is unequivocally a country of negros and mulattos, and that is a fact that some people find it hard to accept. They do not want to accept a reality, that is that we are a country of negros and mulattos. This is a country of negros and mulattos. Although participants in Santiago, Santo Domingo, and Dajabon acknowledge and affirm African heritage and even Black identity, these discourses remain a part of a minority perspective in the Dominican Republic. However, although this perspective is in the minority, such views have been present fairly consistently throughout the nation's history and are gaining traction as globalization, transnationalism, and technology normalize Black identities in this space. The responses in this section suggest that the broad strokes of exceptionalist discourses do not accurately represent the complexity of Black identity in the Dominican Republic. Although throughout the nation's history, those in power have disparaged, diminished, and actively tried to erase the country's connection to Africa, these projects have not been completely successful. In fact, many Dominicans readily acknowledge African ancestry, although some downplay it as behind the ear. Adding nuance to the conversation are Dominicans who foreground Blackness and even celebrate it. These voices are frequently excluded from broader academic and social narratives on Dominican racial identity. The second section of this presentation extends the question of discourses on Blackness to specifically examine how a connection to Africa is enacted by those who affirm a Black identity. As in the case of other post-colonial spaces in the West, the espousal of a Black identity does not ensure that individuals have a cultural or linguistic knowledge of Africa. In a country where those in power have consistently recast African descent as a burden borne by the republic on the other side of the island, Haiti, Dominicans who choose to identify with their African past use discourse as a tool to connect themselves to this heritage. As I conducted research in the border city of Dajabon, overlooking the Haitian city of Juanamen from the banks of the Masacre River, I toured the city with Manuel, the local folklorist and culturologist. As a note, I just indicated there in the picture really how close the border of the two countries is. DR on my right side or on the bottom and Haiti on the north side. There's no actual physical border, it's a river. Once you cross the river, you've moved from one country to the other. So Manuel is a local culturologist and folklorist, and he's active in the culture of the border region and has more than 30 years of experience organizing cultural events. In addition to this experience, he has received training as a folklorist from UNESCO and from the Ministry of Culture of the Dominican Republic. In the border region, Manuel is widely considered an expert on culture and folklore, and he is frequently invited to speak at international conferences. During a morning visit to a local nonprofit organization, Manuel begins to sing a song whose lyrics I cannot distinguish as Spanish. He tells me that the song is part of an oral tradition that emerges from the country's African origins. During our interview later that day, I asked Manuel if he can sing the song again for me to record, and I will play a clip of the song now.
Había dicho que hay tradiciones orales de origen español, de origen japonés, americano, norteamericana. También hay algunas de origen también africana. Sí. Aquí hay varias, pero hay una que dice Ginganguli guli guli wacha gangu gingangu ginganguli guli guli wacha gingangu gingangu ela chea ela ginganguli guli guli wacha gingangu gingangu ginganguli guli guli wacha gingangu gingangu.
Ginganguli constructs a narrative of a distant African past and its place in Dominican culture. When Manuel sings Ginganguli, his voice is strong and confident. According to Manuel, the song starts off African in lines 1 through 6 and ends like a Spanish Salve Regina in lines 7 through 9. He continues, "This song reflects who we are, Africans, Spanish, and the indigenous part." Manuel then describes what the song represents and how it fits with present understandings of Dominican heritage and identity. Ginganguli does not use a familiar linguistic code like English or Spanish, and when I initially heard Manuel sing it, I could not immediately place it. Subsequent background research on Ginganguli reveals that the song has a rather interesting origin. Ginganguli does not in fact originate on the African continent. Rather, the British Lord Robert Baden-Powell of the Boy Scouts organization composed a song for the first World Scout Jamboree in 1920. The original song lyrics have no actual meaning, but are said to facilitate pronunciation irrespective of mother tongue. I include the example of Ginganguli here, not to frame Manuel as ignorant. In fact, Manuel has a wealth of cultural and historical knowledge about the border region and its oral tradition. Rather, the proffering of Ginganguli as a connection to a distant African past broaches the topic of the African imaginary in this space and beyond. This prompts me to consider the question of how Afro-descended peoples construct a connection to a geographically, linguistically, and culturally distant motherland. Manuel chooses to accept and espouse an African past in a cultural space that does not require or even encourage it. That there is a disconnect between this African imaginary and reality should not be viewed as an indictment of Manuel's identity, but rather as an indication of the lasting cultural and linguistic toll of colonialism. The discussion here turns to the positionality and accountability of a Black researcher studying race in the social, cultural, and linguistic space, of the Dominican Republic. My cultural positioning as a Black American gave participants license to espouse Blackness in a social space that has not traditionally been Afro-affirming. As participants interacted with me, they often invoked famous Black Americans into the conversation: Michael Jordan, LeBron James, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Sammy Davis Jr., Harry Belafonte, Denzel Washington. Because of globalization and because of the transnational nature of the Dominican diaspora, participants were very aware of how race was viewed in other countries and contexts. As a Black researcher from the US, I also grappled with my responsibility with respect to transient structures of privilege in the research setting. By flexing my Americanness, I could change the course of an interaction because Americanness brought presumptions of power and socioeconomic status. Thus, I wielded my Americanness cautiously so as not to interrupt normal interactions. Finally, my perspective as a member of the African diaspora, whose own history was disrupted by the Middle Passage, allowed me to relate to certain language particularities of post-colonial identity formation. Moreover, nuances in the language used to talk about Blackness were apparent to me, although not widely discussed in broader literature on race and identity in the Dominican Republic. This paper began by considering the current framing of the academic conversation on race and identity in the Dominican Republic. By employing language as an analytical tool, I've explored and analyzed racial discourse in an increasingly complex social and cultural setting. The first section of the discussion talks and testifies to the complexity of Black identity by engaging discourses on Blackness that are infrequently acknowledged. These discourses push back against broad-stroke narratives of confusion and denial and negotiate the positioning and importance of Blackness and African ancestry in an increasingly globalized and transnational space. The second section of the discussion talks and testifies to the shared fragility of our cultural imaginaries. This discussion again calls into question the idea of Dominican exceptionalism by positioning the Dominican Republic within the broader context of Afro-descendant peoples tasked with reconstructing a connection to a geographically, linguistically, and culturally distant motherland. As the identities of Afro-descendant people in the West shift between imagination and reality, language is the medium that frames and conveys these identities to the world. As Black linguistic anthropologists continue to bear scholarly witness to the way that language works in the world, we are tasked with the responsibility of framing language as a site of identity construction and negotiation, of validating voices of those who exist at the margins, of unpacking the complexity of Black identities, and of testifying to Black humanity in spaces where these voices have not always been heard. I would like to briefly acknowledge my funding sources, who so generally sponsored my research in the Dominican Republic. Gracias and thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Crystal Smalls, who's going to speak on Black semiosis and theorizing Black ways of speaking. Okay.
Good morning, greetings. I'm so indebted to my collaborators here and not here. And I'm just really grateful for this space and this opportunity to have this conversation. So my talk today is a little bit more of a meditation. It's a paper, but it's definitely still kind of in progress, this idea of theorizing, really re-theorizing Black ways of speaking as survival codes. So in many ways, this paper provides a meta-pragmatic account of and also provides examples of significations of survival that have constituted Black ways of speaking and being since the earliest constructions of Blackness. So I will speak of layers of coding, actually through layered coding, these kind of superimposed registers that result in the kind of subversive signifying that many of us in this room have long mastered. We are indebted, all of us, to a rich tradition of Black fugitive scholarship and signification that has laid the groundwork, in many ways by providing a kind of floor plan of the ivory tower, if you will, for myself and others who do this work on Black language and culture. So today, let me make sure I do. I'd like to explore possibilities of achieving more analytic precision in our readings of processes through which meaning is made about Blackness. That is to say, how signs are inscribed with racialized meanings and how these signs are deployed on various scales. And also for us to gain more precision in understanding the meaning-making processes and strategies that are conditioned by and made through Blackness. That is to say, the experience of being raced as Black and how that may codify or condition ways of meaning-making. So I'll first be focusing on the latter, expression of Black semiosis, by considering the ways structures of race, Blackness in particular, have impacted the development of particular language development varieties. And I'll be conjecturing a semiotic model or some renovations, interventions to prevalent semiotic models that more systematically attend to the materiality of the body as a relevant constituent in any process of interpretation or translation in the semiotic process. And one of the many reasons that I'm exploring a racialized account of semiosis is to contribute to the reconceptualization of these various ways of communicating that were carefully crafted and very courageously mobilized along the coasts of Western Africa, in the villages of Oceania, on plantations in the American South, and on the mountainsides of various Caribbean isles, to reconceptualize them not as apolitical derivatives of various kinds of quote-unquote language contact, as many Creolists suggest in their, I think, ahistorical and very thinly historicized accounts of Creole genesis. So I hope to underscore how the evolutionary trajectories of these ways of speaking, with their various lexifiers and super straight source languages and so on, were not solely shaped by a need or desire to communicate in a European target language, and then a target language that wasn't met, as many of these theories suggest, because of their more complex grammars. But we're actually shaped by an ecology of white supremacist ideologies and systems and practices, and very specifically by anti-Black racism. Additionally, some Creolists suggest that these trajectories were animated by agentive strategic actors on all fronts, even if they are positioned very differently. For example, Farraklas's volume, Agency and the Emergence of Creole Language, interrogates assumptions of forced language acquisition and a kind of unidirectional language development. Philip Baker's notion of a medium for interethnic communication reconceptualizes target languages in this development of these varieties that we call Creoles. So a close examination of the actual socio-cultural, socio-political contexts of right now what we'll call non-indigenous Black language in their evolution, so the development of pidgins, creoles, and dialects in the old and new worlds, reveals that although there's nothing or not much that's structurally exceptional about these varieties to warrant a distinct typology, the despotic nature of many of the germane events that we refer to as language contact may have engendered very particular discursive or pragmatic practices. So whether animated by the actual trade of human flesh or of poached natural resources, or by the sequestering of Black bodies in overcrowded, under-resourced spaces, the types of contact that have yielded the pidgins, jargons, slangs, and dialects developed by Black peoples throughout Africa, the Americas, Oceania, and parts of Asia were and are invariably characterized by oppression and often terror. Some might contend that we parse indigenous languages or indigenous language varieties of Africa and Oceania from quote-unquote Black languages because such languages emerge prior to the manifestation or construction of Blackness as a relevant condition of being. So this becomes especially applicable when we begin to survey the notion of Blackness in regards to semiosis. Oh, I think I should have shown that before. So that's to say the hybridized language varieties of concern here are not only Black because Black identified people speak them or created them, they are also effectively Black in the sense that they were made through the ideological and material intervention of Blackness and through the psychic experience of living in a Black identified body. So from this posture, we can begin to speak of a bifold Black semiotics that examines one, semiosis of Blackness, of making meaning of Blackness, as I said, and two, the racialized a racialized semiosis, or a distinctly Black way of making meaning, of which one iteration has already been identified and copiously and beautifully theorized as signifying. So this geminated conception of Black semiosis partly emerges from, Michael Silverstein's dialectic indexicality, which demonstrates how science not only index or point to phenomena in the world, micro, macro, and between, but also how they entail such phenomena, and in doing so help constitute social context or social reality. In other similarly complex words, racialized subject formation as it plays out in infinitesimal interactional events involves both the usage and the reification, or kind of re-racialization, of already racialized signs, and the construction of new indices of race. So regarding enslaved persons in the United States, Marcy Morgan introduces the concept of counterlanguage, which she describes as, quote, a conscious attempt on the part of U.S. slaves and their descendants to represent an alternative reality through a communication system based on ambiguity, irony, and satire, as cited in Spears' 2008. So Morgan's and others' accounts deeply consider the context of oppression and danger in which many non-Indigenous Black languages were developed, demonstrating how something like indirectness not only allowed for creative and covert expression of thought and affect, but also how it derived from particular, though overlapping histories of subjugation and terror that required quick-witted practices of resistance and sometimes insurgence. Or as Arthur Spears has tendered, quote, indirection appears to have developed as a life-preserving, soul-saving means of resistance, particularly to the workings of white supremacist racial hatred and internalized oppression during slavery and after, for example, during the Reign of Terror in the United States, often euphemized as by the term Jim Crow era. Saidiya Hartman vigilantly explores this very history, slavery and post-slavery in the Americas, and documents some of the performative and interactional strategies of resistance that enslaved Black people used to salvage and reconstitute their humanity. She explains that clandestine acts of resistance, that's her language, often occurred under the guise of fun and frolic, and helps us understand the context through which this agentive but forced indirectness emerged. With her historiography and theory in mind, I'd like to contribute to recalibrating the sociolinguistic concept of indirectness, as in this context as a kind of compulsory esotericism and one of many examples of Black semiosis. And I'm interested in designating a specific practice that was born of material dehumanization and a pervasive threat of death that was necessarily indirect and double articulated, including layers of meaning intended only to be construable to particular others in a given audience, namely those who were in the same precarious state. So indirectness was and is used to express authentic joy in the face of white terror, to disarm potential white aggressors, and in this sense was used to counter, discredit, or plot against entities that were that undermine the speakers and intended audience members' humanity. The substantial body of sociolinguistic literature on signifying and other forms of indirectness encourages us to consider the practice as an integral part of Black ways of speaking, to use Delheim's term, in which individuals are socialized. And an expansion on the phenomenon from scholars like Hartman, Morgan, Smitherman, and Spears encourages us to reimagine practices like signifying as integral parts of Black ways of being in the world. And like most ingrained cultural practices of survival, meta-discursive or meta-linguistic awareness is not common among users, nor is such awareness necessary to do specific interactional work. It's not common, but it certainly does exist. So this excerpt from fieldwork I conducted in South Carolina Low Country in 2009, illustrates a very keen awareness of the keen awareness of the origins and contemporary functions of some indirect Black ways of speaking. So can I get a volunteer to help me read this? Somebody to be Lola, maybe? I'll be me? Okay. Begin.
that I always thought that that story was so capital because the thing that you learned when you were here was you learned how to speak about a white person in their presence without them knowing it. And I continued to do that. I tried to teach it to my children. I don't think the current generation does it very much.
Yeah.
They just don't quite get it when you know, it's a lot of eye movements in the body. You can talk about a white person right while they're sitting there and they won't have a clue about what you're saying.
Oh.
And you can, you know, speak the truth about them and they still won't get it. And it's not all words, but there's, you know, it's a methodology and I hate we've missed that, but we don't know how to do that anymore. Yeah, that seems like another level of
Oh, I'm sorry, that was me.
Oh, sorry.
I left my kid. Sorry. Yeah, that seems like okay. Yeah, that seems like another level of language that we had. I guess you're saying that we've lost? And then you start there. I messed up, sorry.
Exactly. And you had to be able to warn your friend or your coworker or whatever they might have been in the presence of somebody and they were asking you to do something and you had to know what to say or what to, you know, if you didn't want to do it or whatever.
Right.
And so you used your parents frequently. My parents would tan my hide if I got involved in something, you know, in something like that or whatever. And so it's just, it was a way of talking.
Yeah.
That we can't do anymore.
Thank you. That's awesome. So Lola was a 60-something graduate of the historic Avery School, now the Avery Institute in Charleston, South Carolina. And she shared this when I was asking her about teaching and learning Gullah Geechee language or language practices as a young woman growing up in Charleston. And so she rendered Gullah Geechee a way of talking, and she demonstrated that much more than a mere code, it included an enculturated system of indirect signals that are used to carry out a host of tasks. In this case, protect speakers and interlocutors from various harms, namely those inflicted by white people. So this stretch of talk transpired in the presence of an ostensibly white man, one of her colleagues, who seemed to be within earshot of our conversation. So she lowered her voice to a nearly inaudible level when saying the word white and modeled the very discursive tactics of survival that she described in the excerpt. So interventions by Black language scholars, like the game-changing volume that Lenita showed earlier, Black Linguistics, and also new methodologies and concepts like Sammy Aleem's critical hip-hop ethnography and Jonathan Rosa and Nelson Flores's theorization of racial linguistic ideologies, Marcy Morgan's counterlanguages we saw, and many others. These have been vital for modifying the paradigms and the very tools that we use to explore racialized language practices, like the one that Lola described and theorized as well. From their work, we learned that as Black scholars of language and culture, we must not only renovate dominant theory, but also exhume our own deep-seated anti-Black predispositions. That is, we must deeply consider Teresa Perry's observation that Black language is the last uncontested arena of Black shame. So I'm suggesting that for a better understanding of the role of race in semiosis or meaning-making through science, we also need recalibrated theory, analytical tools, and more uncomfortable reflection. My own socialization into and my investment in this kind of recalibration makes the task of performing Black semiotics or racialized semiotics even more formidable and more fulfilling. So Paul Thibault's text on social semiotics interprets the field of study as an intervention that, quote, starts from the praxis-oriented view that our practice as analysts in theories of social meaning-making practices and their textual products in our own and other social semiotic systems is itself a set of social meaning-making practices, just like those we study and analyze. So this kind of reflexive stance is central to decolonizing linguistic and semiotic anthropology, an enduring project in which the field's sister field, cultural anthropology, got a comparable call from Fair Harrison around the same time in the early 90s. So from here, I'm imagining and formulating a theoretical framework of Black semiotics that is always constituted in and through a given ensemble of Black semiosis practices. And I'm earnestly considering Thibault's insistence that semiotic theory not just be a science of signs that disarticulates and deconstructs, but that it actively rearticulates and reconstructs something as well. And I consider this kind of impetus to be a vital artery that connects semiotics and Africana studies, any Black studies, critical ethnic studies, gender studies, these other kindred vocations in which repositions of the theorist as one who rearticulates but doesn't necessarily confirm everyday meaning making or folk theories about meaning making. So these are also fields in which are modes of knowledge production that are actually constituted through reflexivity and practices. So all of this underscores, one, how our theories are always already there in some form, right? We don't actually create them. They're always immanent in people's everyday lives and in their metapragmatic and metalinguistic commentaries and theories. And also, too, how we must rearticulate these activities and meta-commentaries to make new, relevant, critical meaning of them. So among other things, Peirce's very generative semiotic model and accompanying theory expanded Saussure's binary that we're all familiar with, the signifier or signified model, to include the process of translation and its apparatuses. This is what he called the interpretant, or I would say interpretant. Theoretically, Black semiotics is actually a more precise Peircean interpretant, or a translation that helps rearticulate the connection between a class of reference or meanings and a class of signs or sign vehicles, representamen. In this case, the connection between Blackness and various meanings of Blackness and particular signifiers. So the necessity for a distinct theory about meaning, the meaning of and meaning through the construction of Blackness derives from also the oft-cited Peircean principle that the greater the degree to which a sign vehicle intends or denotes a particular meaning, the fewer meanings there are available that it can intend. So simply put, the more specific the meaning of the sign, the fewer things it can be used to denote in the world. The difference between a bird versus fowl versus chicken versus hen. Concerning Black semiotics, the theoretical specificity of Black semiosis only extends to meaning making articulated through Black bodies and consciousnesses, or the experiences of being socially raced as Black and developing a functional subjectivity through that designation. So this specificity, which can be extrapolated to attend to any pertinent historical racial schema, which I'll talk about in a minute, requires attendance to human actors in semiotic mediation. So Fanon's historical racial schema was one part of his two-part intervention in Merleau-Ponty's phenomenological model of the corporal schema, a concept that addresses just basically the way humans experience the world through their bodies. Dylan Hendren, I think I'm saying his name correctly, has described Fanon's corrective in the following way. They say, the historical racial schema are the sedimented and knotted fabric of self-experiences of anti-Black racism and its interpolating discourses, sort of the pre-reflective consciousness memory of lived experiences of racist violence. So his words illustrate not only this existentialist charge of racialized meaning making, but also the material experiences of different kinds of bodies. So in keeping with these Peircean tenets, meanings always entail the signs through which they're expressed, and those signs entail the method or means of translation. Actually, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So all of this means that we must seriously consider human interpreters in semiosis, and therefore must take into account conditions around actually defining the human and experiencing humanity. Specific and historicized attendance to race, class, gender, and religion then become necessary starts. So in many ways, Black semiotics attempts to answer Stuart Hall's reverberating question, what is this Black in Black popular culture, which Michelle Stevens recasted as what is this Black in Black diaspora, by considering how it is that an abstraction, a social, cultural, political, economic construction, as we talk about it, like Blackness, predicates Black bodies, Black personhood, and other Black entities, and thereby constitutes a mode of very specifically Black being in the world. So parsing Black semiosis also becomes a helpful project when we consider indexicality and processes of enregisterment in more politically and historically specific ways. The sociogenic and ontogenic conditions around what is possible for Black and other non-white race individuals have to be considered when theorizing how sense is made of reference and signs relating to social identity. In the most universal context of white supremacy, making meaning about humans is strikingly different for individuals whose selfhood and notion of personhood were steeped in a rubric that located him, her, them, and those that they were bracketed with in the center or the top. So for those who customarily find themselves up against whiteness, as Stacey Lee put it, as they conceptualize beauty, intelligence, democracy, modernity, civility, and self, race and all of its effective racial economies cannot be tangential theoretical concerns, but must actually reconfigure theory altogether. So the bodies of work produced by scholars like Aleem and Mary Buchholz, Elaine Chun, Celia Cutler, Michelle DeGraff, Nelson Flores, Jane Hill, Wad Ibrahim, Adrian Lowe, Sally Coco Mufwene, Angela Reyes, Lenita Huey, Jacobs Huey, Jonathan Rosa, Geneva Smitherman, Arthur Spears, and many, many others. They have directly and indirectly pierced this kind of contextual foreclosure that studies of language and semiotics frequently erects around its own racialized epistemes, right, and inferences and contingencies. And it's my hope to help dilate these punctures that have been made. Thank you.
I see I don't have a flat surface. Okay. I'm Arthur Spears, and I want to thank Crystal for organizing this panel. It was an idea whose time has come, so to speak. Okay. What I want to do is go general, and that's what Crystal asked me to do, and talk about some of the basic issues and ideas that we confront when we talk about Black linguistics, Black linguistic anthropology, how we do our research, and so forth. The title of my talk is Blackening Linguistic Anthropology. And I could also say that the subtitle is Linguistic Anthropology, Black Linguistic Anthropology, rather, Then and Now. My talk is divided into 4 parts, and so I want to make 4 main points, and then each one of those has some sub-points. And you can follow me with the handout that I distributed before. So the first point simply elaborates on that term, blackening linguistic anthropology. What does that mean? I'll make 3 points. When I think of linguistic anthropology, I think of it broadly, and it's the study of the interrelationships among language, society, and culture in the broad sense. Of course, once a subfield gets named, there's a certain group of questions, certain methodologies and theories that the bulk of the practitioners adhere to. But I just wanted to lay out that I'm thinking of it in that broad sense. I want to talk also about the history of Black scholars in linguistic anthropology as I'm talking about it in the broad sense. And I'm going to begin with Mark Hanna Watkins, and I'll say a few remarks about him. And the third thing I'm thinking about is ways that current and future Black linguistic anthropologists can act upon the program that has been termed Black linguistics. And that was discussed in Maconie and all 2003, and the title of the volume is Black Linguistics. Now, my second major point, Blacks in the Study of Language in Society and Culture. And I'm going to begin with what Black linguistics is as it was laid out in that volume, Black Linguistics in 2003. So Black linguistics involves four main principles with regard to practitioners and their research. The first one, membership in or life experience with the communities whose languages we research and analyze. Keeping in mind that membership can be a matter of degree, always. Second, use of an ideological orientation designed to analyze and expose the workings of ideology in research on, about, and for Black languages. Use of race as a defining feature in our linguistic autobiographies and as Black languages and scholars. Now, when I just mentioned Black languages, I should elaborate just a little bit, but I don't want to spend too much time on it. We're talking about the languages globally that are spoken by those who have been racialized as Black, and in terms of community, society, and geopolitics, share certain features. So we're not talking about genetic language families in any sense. I just wanted to point that out. The fourth point is analysis of language as social practice, with a keen eye and ear attuned to its socio-history. Also, attuned to changes and continuities in the categories of thought and the historiography of linguistic analyses of Black languages at different historical periods. Now, I want to say something about Crystal's intervention. Her remarks illustrate the application of all four principles. She illustrates how Black semiosis is the direct result of the lived experiences and communal histories of racialized Black bodies in racially structured societies. Now, her main example is indirectness, which widely occurring in Black languages, not just in the US. Indirectness is a defining trait of signifying, but much broader than signifying alone. Indirectness is incorporated into African American English grammar through grammatical camouflage, whereby the Black identity of African American English grammatical features is rendered largely undetectable. Also, Crystal Smalls prompts us again to look into the vast research area of distinctively Black ways of speaking and traits of African American English grammar. Now, in African American English, indirectness and other principles, as I call them, for example, camouflage, directness, prosodic semantics, semantic license, augmentation, and so forth, are at once both grammatical and metadiscursive principles. They relate to grammar and communicative practices. This fact proves yet again that culture is inextricable from grammar. That can't be repeated too often. Next point, the history of Black linguistics. Some highlights up to the 1970s generation of scholars doing research in language in society and culture. So I'm going up to the 1970s in terms of those who got their PhDs before that period. And I should place Geneva Smitherman, the well-known linguist, into that group. She got her PhD in 1969 from the University of Michigan. Now, at this point, I also want to remember Margaret Wade Lewis, who is was the historian of Black linguistics. And her main work was the book Lorenzo Dow Turner, Father of Gullah Studies. And she also produced a collection of writings on other scholars in what we're terming Black linguistic anthropology or linguistics. The next person I want to mention, and I mentioned him first, is Lorenzo Dow Turner, who I just mentioned, who was the first to establish unequivocally, based on empirical research, the African linguistic and cultural content of the Gullah language. It's classified as a Creole language. And he did that in Africanisms in the Gullah dialect in 1949, which was the first book-length treatment of a U.S. Creole language. Secondly, Mark Hanna Watkins, who I mentioned above, who passed away in 1976 and spent most of his career at Howard University, the historically Black institution in Washington, D.C. He was an Africanist. His PhD was in 1933 in anthropology, but he specialized in linguistics, and that was at the University of Chicago. He was, interestingly, the first American, any American, to write a grammar of an African language, and the book was titled A Grammar of Chichewa, a Bantu language. He trained with Sapir, and Leonard Bloomfield, who some of you may be familiar with, was a outside member of his dissertation committee. The next person I want to mention is Joseph Applegate, who passed in 2003. He spent the last years of his career at Howard University. Along with Chomsky, he was trained by Zelig Harris at the University of Pennsylvania and got his PhD in 1955. His dissertation was on Berber, and he had later in his career publications on the language of the drug trade. He was the first Black faculty member at MIT and taught linguistics with Chomsky and Holley there, and became director of MIT's New Language Laboratory in 1959. Afterwards, he was faculty member at UCLA before moving to Howard, where he was one of the founders, along with Mark Hanna Watkins, of the first African Studies program offering a PhD in the country. The next is Beryl Loftman Bailey, who was a Creolist, specializing in Creole languages. And she was the first Black woman linguist in the U.S., she was born in Jamaica, to first systemize on its own linguistic terms the grammar of a Creole language, and that was Jamaican patois, within a generative transformational grammar framework. And the title of the book where she presented that was Jamaican Creole Syntax. I've also mentioned Claudia Mitchell-Kernan at UCLA, who went into administration during the later years of her career. She was the first to write a book on Black communicative practices and grammar based on participant, actually I could say member, observation research. And that book was, that research was presented in the Language Behavior in a Black Urban Community, which appeared in 1974. The last two that I will mention are Orlando Taylor and Ida Stockman, who were early scholars in the 1960s, particularly, who worked to describe and vindicate African American English. And then, as I said, coming right at the end of the period that I'm talking about before the 70s was Geneva Smitherman. And of course, her best known book is probably, she has several that are quite well known, but let's say her first best known book was Talking and Testifying. And she insisted on leaving the apostrophes off of the end of Talking and Testifying. The third major point I want to make is the need to study up in investigating language and race. What is the macro context in the society or national, regional, global level? And Lenita Jacobs confronts this point very well. First, the study of language and race must be carried out within the explicit context of theories of society, culture, and oppression. They shouldn't simply remain in the background, but they need to be mentioned and sketched as a framework for the specific research that we present in a particular work. As Lenita Jacobs has put it, there's concern about linguistic anthropology's isolating language from particular macro-social structures and searching for evidence of matters bearing upon race merely at the micro level of talk and interaction. Secondly, this remark of Jacobs is echoed in Crystal Small's comment after Thibault that Black linguists should be critical activists and, quote, pierce the contextual foreclosure, unquote, wrought by would-be theoreticians who would position race as a tangential concern. Fundamental points. Also, she sees as more valuable speaking to the promise of language research to unpack other kinds of truth and scholarly imperatives so that we can open our fields of inquiry, experiment with our writerly voices, and bring our political stances and intellectual quests to the fore. Next point, a fundamental understanding of race can't be achieved absent the placement of race and racism into the context of oppression overall. That is, race and racism are simply one strand of the oppressive, exploitative matrix as implicated in oppressive social hierarchies. Hierarchies tied to not just race, but also gender, sexuality, socioeconomic class, religion, immigration status, national origin, and so forth. And all of the foregoing individually and intersectionally. Now, on the macro level of what I call the political economic pentad are the following 5 things. Number 1, the global system. 2, the state. 3, ideology and coercion, which in practice are 2 sides of the same coin. 4, social stratification. 5, oppression and exploitation, which again are 2 sides of the same coin. Next point, there's no reason for all linguistic anthropologists and scholars of language and society and culture not to do this. There's every reason that we must do this. In other words, place race and racism in its macro context. We don't have to start from the beginning since there are already treatments of this macro context I'm referring to. There are already treatments that we can draw on, and one is Jane Hill's book on language and racism in 2008. There's also the 1999 book, edited volume, Race and Ideology. Next point. Aline calls for research within the framework of the political economic pentad, as I've named it. He does this in his introduction to his book, edited by him, John Rickford, and Arnitha Ball. It just came out, and the book is Ratiolinguistics, How Language Shapes Our Ideas About Race. They want to advance the ratiolinguistic perspective by, and I quote, looking comparatively across diverse ethno-racial and linguistic contexts to better understand the role of language in maintaining and challenging racism as a global system of capitalist oppression. Eva Wheeler's study of race in the Dominican Republic is an excellent step in the right direction. She questions previous studies of the Dominican racial system and uses her empirical research to revise, amplify, and in some cases ratify those previous studies. Her study participates in the construction of a theory of racial systems, still urgently needed for establishing the flow of assets, not just capital alone, assets managed and regulated by language. and that's in, out, and through the global system. Wheeler lays down the challenge to theorize, globalize, historicize, dynamicize, and political economicize our research on race and language. So fundamental that we need to coin some new words to talk about it. The fourth main point that I'll close my remarks with is the need to question and shove aside, if necessary, the received theories and methodologies delivered to us in graduate school. Now, often they're useful, of course, but when they aren't, when we need to push them out or set them aside, what do we have to do? Too many of us, Black scholars included, continue to conduct research shackled by the graduate school questions and frameworks handed us. There's a need for us to push ourselves to confront profound threats to Black and overall human well-being and existence. Also, we have to struggle against the recognizability trap, as I call it, whereby activist critical scholarship too often is marginalized or rejected for not slavishly reproducing studies mirroring the products of our graduate school training. Okay. And as I've written, our graduate school masters, which they are while we're in graduate school. And many of them, of course, are what I refer to as the theory mandarins, who are licensed to theorize grandly by white supremacy and intended ills. So what I want to say finally is break out of the received paradigms wherever necessary and feel free to go forth boldly and theorize grandly for the sake of human well-being and the continuation of human existence. Thanks. Now, fortunately, we have a somewhat expanded period for questions and answers, so I'm going to throw the floor open. My hearing is a little bad, so I hope you will go to the microphone, and I assume the microphone is working, and just volley your questions up to our distinguished panelists. Okay. Did you? Okay. I'm going to go down so I can see the light
Hi, thank you for the really nice panel and wonderful comments. I'm glad there's a microphone because I have no voice as it is today. I had a question, really, especially for the Caribbeanist on the panel, but others might have thoughts about this as well. I saw come up in one of your transcripts the word vino. And it's something I've seen in my work in the Caribbean as well, this sort of category. And there's been some writing about this sort of category, and it often is put in contrast to Blackness. So, for example, the formulation negro pero fino, black but fine, elegant, or whatever. And I was just wondering if you had some thoughts about how that's in play in the Dominican Republic, and I think more broadly, in the Black Atlantic as a sort of discourse to critique.
Thank you very much. Yes, I definitely saw the use of different strategies to kind of dilute the sting of Blackness. And so one of the reasons why I very much see the Dominican Republic as a part of this broader story of Afro-descended peoples in the West is that in the Dominican Republic, as in many other spaces, Blackness has historically been something that was viewed very negatively. And so to call someone negro without a modifier could be seen as an insult. And so in order to counteract the presumed negative status of saying someone is negro or moreno, sometimes people will use words like fino, fine, other words like lavado, which literally means washed, but is used to kind of say, well, like, you're negro, but not so negro that I see it negatively. And so, like, you can definitely see how anti-Blackness is kind of ingrained in this notion of just Blackness, period. Like, Blackness comes with a presumption of anti, and then you counteract that by using different strategies, either linguistically or in terms of your actual mannerisms and your tone, as you were talking about in your examples. And so something also about the word negro in the Dominican Republic, it's so complex because it can be the worst insult that you can call someone, but it is also the most endearing term you can call someone. And so there's really nothing in between. Like, either you're using it to tell someone that they are nothing to, get out of here, I hate you, or you're using it to say, you are the most valuable person to me. And the way that negro works in the Dominican Republic is also very interesting because it can be used to describe people who phenotypically are not Black if it's used in that context of cariño or it was like in English, I'm struggling for the word, but to say that someone is close to you. So one example that people told me, if there are two spouses and they're both blonde hair, blue eyes, white and Dominican, they can say to each other, mi negro, mi negra, and it has nothing to do with phenotype, it has to do with affect. And so negro is just this fascinating term because it can be infused with positive or negative affect using modifiers and then also communicating with tone. So I've definitely seen fino and I've seen lavado and a bunch of different strategies to try to extract that negative affect from the term and recast it as something positive.
Another question?
Greetings. Well, kind of in line with your last comments, Dr. Spears. There's a few things that baffled me. I saw the term anti-Black racism, and in one of the slides, one of the presentations, and it made me think back to one of the gains, one affirmations made in the UK, being part of this United Nations Decade for People of African Descent. And there's an assertion of the word Afrophobia. And it's just interesting because I've never heard anti-Black racism, but I know what Afrophobia is. And it just made me think, it's the same thing like a couple of days ago, someone talked about the enslaved people, which is correct. And then, of course, we still keep slipping back into slaves and slave owners. And, I call that enslavers. I've never referred to enslavers as slave owners. And it made me think, does the academy and its frameworks kind of like put pressure on us as academics to keep falling into terminology that demonizes or that reasserts white supremacist ideals? And how difficult is it to break out of that without having a cost to your career and actually to the quality of your research? So that's the question.
I've often thought about the same thing, and I continue to think about it. There's more discussion in the book that I mentioned, Makoni et al., Black Linguistics, but I would say this. We would like to get rid of these terminologies and systems and the questions that they ask us here and there in the census and so on and so forth. But essentially, there are social, cultural terminologies and terms that we have to deal with. And one of the ways that we deal with them is that when a term has been used against us, so to speak, it puts us in the same ballpark. We have common problems. We have a common agenda in the sense that we have to work against that impression. So the sociocultural term bands us together. It's just like the people working for a particular company or whatever. They're very different. They're all individuals, but there's a system in place that's part of society and culture that essentially bands them together through their common predicament. And so that's how we use those terms which have been used against us. We use them for us. We take a negative and turn it into something positive, always keeping our eyes on some end situation that we hope will come about, where those terms and terminologies will really be figments of the past. So I hope I've understood your question correctly and that answers it. Would someone like to?
Yeah, I also grapple with this. I think most of us do. The kind of how much, what the full possibility of the utility, I guess, of the master's tools, like the terminology and the actual paradigms, right? The actual theories that we have to, if we are going to, refute them or what have you, they still end up centering our work or being the centers of our work. We have to either respond to them or we have to reproduce them in some way. And that's really what I'm trying to think through with even something as basic, as fundamental as our idea of how a sign is experienced, because that in and of itself already presumes, that there's, so we understand there's this human actor involved in it, but there's an assumption of what human is and what it means to be human, how people experience humanity. So even from something that fundamental that seems very neutral and fine to just kind of work with, when you actually see it applied over and over again in the ways people are actually able to do, semiotic analyses of encounters and completely ignore race because they don't have to address bodies and don't have to address, then for me, that's where that really came to the fore is, right, it's already written into so many of our paradigms, certainly the terminology, but even the underlying ideologies that produce these terms that we have to use or that we find ourselves having to use time and again to be legible. I think we just continue to do exactly what you did, and every time you become aware, you invoke the term that actually deconstructs that underlying ideology, and you say enslaved person, so that we don't, lose sight of what happened, what the process was, and that these were humans.
Eva and Lanita, did you have anything to add to that? No? Okay. Do we have other questions?
I'll add just from a personal standpoint, thinking about that same question, because actually that very terminology I've had to grapple with in my work, saying enslaved persons or enslavers, and I was like, actually, this is the first time I've heard enslavers, and so thank you for that term. But I was thinking, about that question of, are we feeling that we're forced to use these terms in order to have legitimacy? And, in my experience, it wasn't so much a feeling of being forced, but this was the terminology I was born into, right? And so when we're educated, even from elementary, middle school, high school, this is the language that's in our textbooks. So it wasn't as much like feeling that I was forced, but initially not knowing that there was another way to talk about it. And so right now I live in New Mexico, and right next to us is Texas. And so, there are some textbooks that have recently come out in Texas that talk about slaves as migrant workers. And so they say, migrant workers were brought from Africa to work on the plantations in the South. And so you think about children who are going to be reading those textbooks, and the kind of damage that you'll have to undo when later they say, well, you know, what's the big deal? They were just migrant workers. Why are we all in such a fuss? And then, yeah, Texas is just, it's its own panel. But just to say that, you know, just like these children are going to be learning from those types of textbooks, I learned from textbooks that used words like slaves and slave owners instead of enslaved persons and enslavers. And so it was actually through these kind of like critical analyses and graduate school in itself where I started to actually question this. But I think that outside of the sphere of academia, sometimes there are people who aren't going to encounter those critical moments and just continue to take for granted that this is the terminology that is used because it's the terminology that's always been used.
You know, that's a good point that we work with, revise, and reject those terminologies as we deal with the situation we've been handed. You had a question? Would you speak into the microphone?
Not really a question, so much as an advertisement for the Language and Social Justice group is trying to organize tweeting around language and social justice issues, and clearly you guys are talking about language and social justice, so I wanted to let anybody who tweets know about this so that at AAA for the next couple of days you can tweet, and then we're going to storify these tweets. So the major hashtag is just hashtag LSJ2016, but I'll leave this, I'll give this to you guys up there. Thank you.
One of my colleagues that I didn't recognize due to the bright lights. And we still have a little time in case the panelists had remarks that they wanted to add. Only you have a question.
Sorry, this is made for tall people. I just wanted to say that I really appreciate all of these issues being brought up here at AAA, in which it's very hard to find a space to talk about how white our theory is.
Speak louder.
Okay. I really appreciate having this space at AAA where it's extremely difficult to find a space to talk about how white the theory that we've been given is. And I especially appreciated Crystal's intervention in this space. But I would also like to point out that those people are not here. We are here, right, which is great. So I just want to hear what you have to say about sort of, I mean, this is something Jonathan and I are really struggling with in this paper that we've been trying to write when we were white-splained last year. But sort of thinking about what are the strategies? Do we engage them on their terms? Do we try to prove that we are as theoretically, you know, tough as they are? Do we create this alternate theory, which they're not going to read? I was just wondering and these are not mutually exclusive strategies, but I was just wondering how you think about the sort of broader, you know, project that we're all trying to be engaged in.
Thanks. Panelists?
Thanks, Adrienne. Adrienne was my colleague and peer when I was at UCLA, and we were being trained in linguistic anthropology, and we were part of a group called the Discourse, Identity, and Representation Collective, DIRE. And even at that time, we were trying to think about how to write theory anew and deal with race explicitly. And we all settled up with that in similar and also distinct ways, and experienced different trajectories. I'm just at a point in my life and in my career where I really feel that those three words, let me live. And sometimes for me it means walking away from linguistic anthropology proper, because I just don't have the energy to try to establish race as significant in the language. I'm sorry, the election just kind of was very sobering for me in terms of underscoring the significance of anti-Black racism and the work ahead. So I'm post-tenure, that has something to do with it. I'm also, you know, midlife, post-divorce, where, you know, you just, the real becomes very significant to you. And wanting to write stories that my research participants and my mothers can understand. And for me, that means saying no to a certain kind of legitimacy. I don't care if you quote me. I'd rather that you read me or hear me. And I'm starting to locate a lot of my interventions in the classroom and who I train, and impressing upon them the significance of asking questions that you really don't have to ask to become even an academic celebrity or a star, but impressing upon them the importance of thinking about gender and race and intersectionality. And believe it or not, Kevin Hart was one way to do this. I was asked to do an essay on a black comedian in a volume on stand-up comedy, and they need a black comic to be covered. And I was really excited about Cat Williams, who seems to be in a path of self-sabotage, but is especially gifted. And of course, they said Kevin Hart, and I was like, oh, of course, right? And in some ways, dealing with him and listening to his comedy, he was one of the comics that I followed. I didn't expect him to blow up, but I'm not shocked that he did. It was strikingly Kevin Hart's kind of self-deprecating, sometimes slapstick, some would even say slightly buffoonish, and especially queer humor that got me to a place that I'd never expected, and that was to, in my work as a linguistic anthropologist and speaking across disciplines, to talk about what's decidedly black about black language, what's decidedly black about black culture, and that's where my emphasis is these days. And I may not take everybody with me in that quest, but it's just where I'm at.
Further comments? No? Yeah.
I'll just add briefly, kind of like a coping mechanism or a defense strategy that I've always had in academia is to kind of pull back and decontextualize. And so, as a young scholar, I very much tried to frame my inquiries in a way that the masses would understand and not balk away from. And so when I initially conceptualized my project, I wanted it to be, in the realm of lexical semantics, right? And so I was like, I'm just looking at words, just looking at what they mean. Nothing to see here, just let this one fly under the radar. And in talking with my dissertation committee, they were like, there's so much going on here. And it's great that you're doing this kind of semantic analysis of racial terms, but you might be doing a disservice to the inquiry if you don't go deeper and look into some of the other issues that are present in society. And so, initially I was thinking, I want that legitimacy. I want to put something out that people will read, and if I put it in terms of semantics, lexical semantics, that's kind of like apolitical and taken away from social context, it might have a broader audience. But the product that I put forth that has that broader audience might be incomplete and might not fully represent my perspective. And so I'm taking baby steps towards putting forth that authentic product, but it's something that I definitely struggle with and fight against, because my inclination is to put forth something that isn't making waves. And so I'm learning how to be bold in my scholarship and be able to accept and confront the consequences that come from that boldness.
Yes, I'm also taking baby steps, and I'm learning from people like you, Adrienne, and you, Lenita, in particular, and Jonathan. So I also really kind of parse the audiences, right? So the way I teach is very different from what I just did here, and it's partly because I feel like, there's different people I would like to be able to hear me and to take me seriously and to understand what I'm saying. So. And I'm very, very junior and on the market at the moment. So for me, legibility as a proper linguistic anthropologist is still, I feel like, a toll that I need to pay if I want access to a certain kind of not just security, but also to students, right? At the end of the day, my goal is to be able to be in a department with students and be able to support them and have the resources to do so. So I'm still trying to figure out myself how how and when to speak to whom and how. But the sustaining aspect of all of this and the space where I know what I'm really doing and why I'm here is always in the classroom at the end of the day. And that's what, I don't know, you didn't ask what keeps us going, but that's what I'm responding to.
I just wanted to get in 2 cents before we leave, my 2 cents. And this is that we have a lot to say, obviously, to each other, but also to the public at large. And my wish is that at least sometimes, particularly when we're writing and speaking to the public, that we get rid of that awful serpentine prose that anthropologists so often write in. I often present it to my students, groundbreaking, landmark writings, and the students can't make heads or tails of them. It's a problem. And that's why every chance I get, folks, it's okay to write to the colleagues. We enjoy those serpentine sentences and the vocabulary that comes from the very bottom reaches of the Oxford English Dictionary. But let's remember our true audience, people out there, and write so they can understand us. So that's my point. We're just about finished. What time do you have? None of my clocks are working today. None of my computers are working today. 12. Okay. So with that, we can thank our panelists and thank you for coming.